So our speaker tonight is Wynn Jacobson-Galan. Wynn is an NSF graduate research fellow working on supernova progenitor systems and transient astronomy. Fascinated by the final moments of a star's life before death, Wynn's research focuses on winding back the cosmic clock to understand how certain stars produce the various supernovae observed today. Wynn currently works with Professor Raffaella Margutti on combining multi-wavelength complete picture of the final stages of stellar instability and mass loss before explosion. As an undergraduate, Wynn worked at UC Santa Cruz on thermonuclear transients of all types under the guidance of Professor Ryan Foley. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Wynn. Go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. How's it going? Yeah, really happy to be here. Yeah, I'm glad you all came out. So yeah, my name is Wynn, and yeah, so that was my really long intro that I said to Stephen. But I mean, really, in one sentence, I just really like it when stars die, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And one very interesting star that died towards the end. Okay, so without further ado, I like to start all my talks with a land acknowledgement. So we are part of the UC Berkeley system, the UC Berkeley campus. It exists on indigenous land, unceded indigenous land. And so specifically, the Ohlone people are active members of our community, and the research that I do would not be possible without the sacrifices that they have made and continue to make. And within astronomy, we also have a predicament of trying to understand how to use our land usage that also has telescopes and also indigenous communities who are at odds. And so specifically, my research uses the Keck telescopes on Mauna Kea, and that is a very important place for Indigenous Alliance. So paying homage to that and just recognizing it is the first step, and there's many other steps we can do. So yeah, without further ado, zooming in. So I work on transients, which are basically things that go in and out of the night sky. I use telescopes across the world in space to try to understand things like this, supernova explosion. I'm really interested in combining both the pre and post explosion information of supernovae. So what was the star that produced certain supernovae? How are they like the stars that we see in our Milky Way? How are they not like the stars that we see in our Milky Way? What supernovae are common? What supernovae are not common? And today I'm going to kind of walk you through the process of creating supernovae, the process of understanding supernovae, and then new research, new cutting edge research that we are doing here at UC Berkeley to understand massive stars and their connection to stellar death. So in this talk, I'll be doing just that. So I want to walk us through the evolution of massive stars, so much, much bigger than our sun. How do they produce these violent eruptions, these violent explosions that we see as supernovae? And then an overview of supernovae in general, so we can all come into the same page to talk about the new stuff, which is the story of a particular explosion called supernova 2020 TLF, and the fun, exciting things that we found from this supernova. Okay, so let's start with a very simple question. So what is a star? And many of you may be thinking, well, you know, that's a pretty simple question. That's like too simple. I know exactly what a star is. But I honestly don't know every day what a star is. And I think it's kind of a philosophical question almost because yes, there are physics that hold stars together. Yes, there are things we can teach you in terms of equations. And this is a star and this is not a star because something is bound and something's not is bound. But what is a star is so much more because clearly we don't understand how different stars do certain things towards the end of their lives. And in particular, in my field, I don't understand, and we as a community that studies supernovae do not understand exactly how to go from one certain type of star to a certain type of supernovae that we see in the night sky. And that is a long-standing issue and that we want to really understand. And so not understanding what is a star actually roots itself in what are stars doing in their evolutionary phases, what are stars doing at the end of their life, and then what are stars doing to then basically give up and then turn into something new, which is an explosion. So my real simple definition is just it's a sphere of hot gas, it's plasma, but it's burning and it's fusing other hot gas to keep itself alive. And when it stops doing that, then we get to see some really cool fireworks in space. So the stellar life cycle, going from the formation of a star, which we'll walk through together, all the way to a violent explosion listed here, is not only diverse, but it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of weird steps. This is a very simplistic diagram. There are people that devote their whole lives to understand why we start with one little ball of gas and we end up with this violent explosion, or we don't end up with a violent explosion, or it transforms into another type of star. I mean, there's so many fascinating questions when it comes to stellar astrophysics. And I'm just going to touch on live, how stars make things that go on to create us, to create planets, to create dust, to create new stars. So there's really, really a lot to work with here. And I just want to touch on a little bit of it with you so we can all kind of understand it together. So let's go through making elements step by step. Let's start by making a star together and go through its whole life, because it can't be that complicated, right? So really simplistically, we start with hydrogen. It's the most common element in our universe. There's a lot of it. We can always find some if we want to group it together. And if enough comes together in the universe, it will collapse and it will form a star. It will form basically the first stellar product, which is hydrogen fusion into helium. And as you're going to notice, stars really like to keep burning and burning and burning. It really helps with their outward pressure support, because like us, I mean, like some days are better than others and we kind of want to collapse sometimes. Well, stars always have this internal energy source that keeps them propped up. I wish I did as well. But, you know, I just have to figure out how to make fusion happen inside my body. So stars, this is pretty much the biggest picture and the most common thing that's happening in a star. You look up at a star in the night sky, it's probably burning hydrogen into helium. And what we basically call this is the main sequence. It's a common sequence. We see it happening in our sun. This is the surface of our sun. And it is basically giving hydrogen, it's pushing hydrogen atoms together, they're fusing together to make helium, the second most common element. And this is something that happens for a very long time. For the sun, it will happen for billions of years. We'll never not know the sun not doing it. And for most stars like the sun, it's pretty much always going to be like that. So it's a pretty common process. So I've talked a lot about how I like when stars die. But I haven't really said that I study the sun. Does anyone know what's going to happen to the sun if we're around to see it? I see expansion. Okay. Anything else? Will it explode? No, it won't. Okay, that's good. So now you know that the sun will not explode. That's great. So unfortunately, the sun is not the types of stars that I'm interested in, because it does not produce the capabilities, the mass, the pressure scales, and the necessary components to explode as a supernovae, but it will do some really fascinating things. It will continue to burn helium into carbon and oxygen, and that will, like was demonstrated by the audience, it will expand and puff up and blow off its layers, and it will become this compact, really interesting star called a white dwarf. And so that's pretty much the fate that we have coming for the sun. I don't think we'll be around to see it, especially because the Earth will be engulfed by the expansion of the sun when it puffs out its layers. But now you have something to talk about at parties, you know, when people ask, you know, what if the sun explodes tomorrow? Well, it probably won't, you know. I think we're the keepers of our own destiny in terms of what happens to the Earth. So yeah, so that was a quick segue. Let's get back to something that will actually explode. That's more fun. So let's go to a massive star. So I keep saying massive star, but what does that actually mean? So starting with a sun scale, a sun radius, a sun mass is kind of the units that we can start thinking of, because it's the most familiar star to us. So we can think in terms of a sun, and a solar mass times 10 is basically a massive star. So it's a much more extended star. I'm talking about something that will eventually be 1,000 times in radius, in size and length, as big as the sun. And it will also be at its start greater than 10 times as massive. So 10 suns packed together. Those are the types of stars that I'm really interested in, because they have the potential to push past their main sequence and into burning and creating new elements that are beyond helium, that are beyond carbon and oxygen, and into stuff that like we really care about. We want calcium. We want our calcium in our teeth. We want iron in our blood. We need these elements. So a sun-like star is not going to do that. But if we have a more massive star, that's where we really have potential to create elements, because that's what we're really doing here. We are forming a star. We're moving the star through its evolution, but really we're creating elements. That's the whole process that we're really undergoing here. So in massive stars, like the sun, we'll also have this helium to carbon fusion after hydrogen completes itself. But it's over a more rapid timescale, only a few million years compared to, say, a billion years. And massive stars can live and die many, many times in the time that our sun will just continue to chug along on its couple billion years main sequence. Massive stars can live and die in millions of years, tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. So very, very rapid. And it seems like maybe a million years versus a billion years. It's pretty close, but actually, like, you can't, that's a few orders of magnitude. You can definitely see a lot of evolution in massive stars that we can't see in sun-like stars because they're pretty normal. They're pretty common. So keeping going, we're just going to progress basically along the periodic table. We're going to keep making more heavier and heavier elements because the pressure and the temperature inside this massive star that we're making here is growing. And it's allowing the fusion of heavier and heavier elements to make even heavier and heavier elements. So carbon can then burn into neon. And again, the time scale is shortening. We're only at 1,000 years that this takes to happen. And then it's going to transition again. And then it's going to move into making oxygen. So we need oxygen to breathe. This is where this process is created. This is one of the processes in the universe where oxygen that we are so reliant on and that fills our Earth's atmosphere comes from. And its process stems from extremely dramatic conditions of high pressures, high temperatures, extremely high densities, all in the interiors of stars that are 10, 20, 30 times as big as our sun. And what's happening here is, like you see, like this is a process that won't take very long either. Neon, which is in our signs, will fuse to oxygen for only a few years. It will make a substantial amount, but it won't last very long. It's going to have to keep going. And these are just some of the products. They're, inside stellar interiors. There's so much other types of burning and things, but I just wanted to highlight like the main elements that we really care about because, oxygen, I think, is pretty important to us. So oxygen continues to fuse. It gets onto silicon, and silicon will only really be produced for about a year. Silicon, which is in our MacBook Pros, which has a valley named after it around here. And that all happens in the interiors of stars. And this is really, for this massive star, the last year that it has to, write its will and testament, figure out its last, things it's got to do, say goodbye to family and friends, it doesn't have much life left to live. Its death is really imminent. And maybe you suspected that because this time of burning keeps going down and down and down. It's the only thing that's keeping the star pushing outward alive. Yeah.
Does that time frame go down for each one of these successive elements being used?
That's a great question. So for every heavier element, the fusion process only can't release as much, can only release so much energy. And for heavier and heavier elements, that amount of energy that actually gets released when you bring two things together starts to go down. So it tries to extract energy from these heavier elements. But unlike helium into hydrogen, which is a very efficient process compared to, say, oxygen or into silicon, it's just not getting a lot of energy. It's not getting a lot of support from these reactions. So yeah, that's a fantastic question. And this timescale just keeps going down because it needs, it's kind of in a frenzy. It's trying to figure out how to support itself to keep its gravity from crushing in on itself without with its internal fuel, with this fusion process. So yeah, since this is really the last year it has to live, we really only have one more product left. And it's something that we're pretty familiar with. It's iron group elements. And that is the last element that will be made in this final week that this massive star has alive. And so like we discussed, it will try to take two iron nuclei and push them together and try to extract some energy from it. Iron just happens to be a really pesky element, and it really does not like to give up any energy for what you put in to fuse it together. So iron is just going to resist this process. It's very stubborn. And it's going to say, I'm sorry, you can't rely on me to keep you alive. You can't rely on me to support you against gravity. You're just going to have to figure out the consequences. And what will happen is that fusion will stop and gravity will have to take over. gravity will pull the star inward. And in about a second, the whole star, the stellar interior, will start to collapse in on itself. And in that second, what will happen, and this is a topic that now gets studied constantly because this is something that is only basically theorized, and because we're not able to slice open a star and see how this process looks like, and how we can go from this collapse to then a violent supernova explosion. We are actively looking to try to understand how this process happens. So really, in brief, what we think happens is that collapse occurs, and it will essentially bounce the material off of the core of the star, which is just this really, really dense iron core. And that bounce, plus some additional energy source, should be able to cause additional energy to push the star outward and basically blow it off and expand into a supernova explosion. And so with the supernova explosion, it is the unbinding of all the work we've done, all of the energy and all of the element creation, so all of the oxygen, the carbon, the neon, the hydrogen, the helium, it is now all free to go off into space. It is expanding at very, very high velocities into space, and it becomes us. And I think that we are really a nice product of what supernovae can do. It goes on to make stars and new planets, dust, all these things that make up our periodic table, and these types of elements would not be formed anywhere else. You have to, the iron in your blood, the calcium in your teeth, things like that have to be formed in a stellar interior, and the transport mechanism to get them out into the universe so that they can go on to form planets, so that they can go on to form intelligent life forms like us, has to be a supernova. It's a delivery service. It is taking material and sending it off with some velocity. It goes off into its galaxy, and it gets absorbed and used, basically. And then that's a whole active area of study in itself. So I kind of already talked a little bit about what is a supernova, but just to recap, I kind of think about supernovae as four fundamental things. So they're the endpoints of massive stars. They're also the endpoints of other types of stars, which we'll get into as well. They, like we said, it's the rapid expansion of stellar gas, and they shine much, much brighter than the star was initially. So with that injection of energy, with that expansion of material, you get luminosities, energy per unit time that are, billions, if not millions of the time as bright as the sun that we see in our sky. And as we saw, they're factories for nucleosynthesis, meaning they're factories for making new elements. They're factories for sending elements off into galaxies to then go on to create humans, to create planets, to create everything. And they're really diverse. So what we talked about today, like just now, was the explosion of a massive star. That is not the only way that we can create a supernovae or a stellar explosion. We can merge two white dwarfs together. So the stars that make up that will eventually be formed from our sun, if they're together, they will come closer and closer together, and they will merge to create a type 1a supernovae. And these type of supernovae are extremely fascinating. They help us understand the expansion of the universe, the acceleration of the universe. We, since 2017, now understand that the merging of two neutron stars, which are two stars that are formed after a massive star explosion, so it's actually the star that gets left behind. If they are together in a binary system and they merge, they can not only produce gravitational waves, which we've detected, but they can also produce these rare events called kilonovae, which are sub-energy explosions, but very, very rapid and hard to find. And then another type of explosion that I like as well is if we have, say, a white dwarf with a sun-like star, and the white dwarf is gobbling material from the main sequence star, it has the potential to push the white dwarf over its limit, and the white dwarf will also blow up. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that I can look out in the night sky with telescopes and try to observe explosions and then try to understand their physical systems. Yeah. Yeah.
The two reported white dwarfs are both type 1As then, supernova?
The single merging of the two will be a one type 1a supernova. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
White dwarf main sequence where they cause the white dwarf to explode? That's not a type 1 as well, or?
This one right here.
Yeah.
This could potentially be a type 1A. I just wanted to keep it a little bit agnostic because I study explosions like this, and not all the time will we call them just a normal type 1A. But in a type 1A supernovae is a thermonuclear supernovae from a white dwarf. So in that sense, yes, it is an explosion of a white dwarf. Yeah. I think I saw another question. Yeah.
After carbon, I thought it was nitrogen.
Neon. After carbon, you think it's nitrogen in the periodic table. Yeah. So
How can you skip ahead?
so it's also happening. It's actually, but carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen are also burned during hydrogen burning. It's called the CNO cycle. So it's not necessarily that it skipped it. It's just that is the main product is carbon to neon. It is doing that process as well.
Nitrogen is created in star formation.
Yeah.
So
But it's also primordial as well. Like it is part of the universe.
nitrogen.
Yeah.
Just follow up. Is there a clear demarcation in the case of between various stages, or there's a overlap? It's different.
Yeah, so my final star was kind of just like this perfect onion. It's not that beautiful in reality. We think it's a lot of mixing. There's a lot of stages that happen all at once. But no, yeah, it's somewhat clear. But because we can't slice open a star to see it, we're really reliant on simulations, on what we can do basically with pen and paper to understand that. But we think that it's pretty well defined in that way. And that's also what nuclear physicists like prove in laboratory experiments as well. And so they tell us, this is possible. Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah. Okay. So like I said, supernovae really touch all aspects of astronomy. You can't really get away from us who study supernovae. We always find our way into your field. Galaxy evolution, so the gas and the stuff that it gets ejected in supernovae goes on to influence the galaxy that it's in. So if you want to study galaxies and how they form or make stars or things like that, you have to understand why supernovae are doing what they're doing. Stellar evolution is pretty fundamental. We talked about that, creation of elements. And then with type 1A supernovae, cosmology as well. So certain types of supernovae that come from the explosion of white dwarfs have a very nicely behaved luminosity function as a function of time. So how bright we see them as a function of time. And we and people even at UC Berkeley particularly use these explosions as candles to really understand how far the universe, how rapidly the universe is expanding. And now that we know that it's accelerating. So yeah, I at least have to put it in there, even though I don't have any interest in cosmology. Okay, so let's talk about supernovae in something that's actually tangible. I showed some simulations, but what we can do is we can look up into the night sky. We can look at really pretty galaxies, and we can try to find them ourselves. So let's actually see what a supernova explosion would actually look like through a telescope, because I like tangible things, and that's pretty much what it looks like. So it's there is an individual star there. We think it was probably a white dwarf plus some other star, and it produced supernova 2014J. So supernova is what we call 2014J is the name that we'll call different supernovae or transients. It just means it exploded in 2014, and then we just start adding letters. So A, B, C, D, and we'll go A, A, B, B, things like that. By the end of the year, especially in 2022. We have at least 4 letters attached to every supernova name. It gets pretty overwhelming. But in this year, it exploded pretty early. And these are Hubble Space Telescope images of this supernova that exploded in a galaxy that was about 12 million light years away. So it exploded, and the light itself took 12 million years to get to us, which means it was a very distant galaxy. But that's pretty common. We're usually looking out into other galaxies to try to find supernovae, because in the Milky Way, there really hasn't been one since almost 300 years. I think we're at this point. So the Milky Way is not really the source of supernovae. Local galaxies aren't, but galaxies that are within a few million light years are definitely, you start increasing the number of galaxies that you can see, so you're going to increase the number of stars that are dying. And I think the kind of back of the envelope fact that I've heard that I think still applies is that, every second to 10 seconds in the universe, whether we can observe it or not, a star will die and produce a supernova. So they're happening constantly. So these are really, really common events. However, what becomes rare is the type of supernovae. So let's get into what different supernovae produce different things. So whether it be a massive star or a white dwarf, we can still find these distant explosions in distant galaxies. All these images were actually taken with the nickel 1-meter telescope at Lick Observatory in San Jose. I took these when I was an undergrad, and I compiled these when I was at UC Santa Cruz. And so you can do a lot of amazing things with just a telescope that's 3 feet. And you can find supernovae even with backyard telescopes. We have an amazing network of amateur astronomers that help us find supernovae all the time. So I think that that's definitely a possibility, even as an amateur astronomer. But yeah, what you might notice is that supernovae are pretty bright compared to their background host galaxy. So this is the whole host galaxy. These are some foreground stars. And then these bright, like dots, essentially point sources, are the explosion of a single star. So let's break that down. An entire galaxy hosts tens of billions of stars, just individual stars. And they all have their brightness, and we sum them all up, and that is the brightness of an entire galaxy. Billions of light bulbs put together to make a galaxy. Then one of them explodes, and it produces light that is comparable, if not brighter, than millions of stars put together. So that is essentially why I started studying this. I was so fascinated by that. Yeah.
Is that wouldn't say the case both for massive star supernova as well as the dwarf?
Massive star explosions, on average, will be an order of magnitude fainter. So the supernovae that we'll talk about today from red supergiants, which are 10, 12 solar massive stars, like the ones that we talked about earlier, their luminosity is a little bit fainter than the explosion of a white dwarf. That is probably one of the brighter explosions. However, now we're finding explosions from what we think are massive stars that dwarf this luminosity even, can be extremely, like, billions of times brighter. Yeah, any questions about this? Yeah.
So we're studying the one supernova. You just studied them when you observe the rapid radiation phase. Or for example, you have something in your radar, radar system, Supergiant that is expected to maybe.
Yeah. So the question is, am I looking for? Do I see the supernova after it's already happened, or am I trying to find the star and see the star itself explode? Okay, so that's actually the topic of today's lecture. The latter, so actually seeing the star itself before it explodes, is pretty much an impossibility, like we think. But we think that we, in some instances, have found that. And it's basically two things. One, these galaxies are pretty far away. So a star doing anything that we could detect, like in an individual point source in a galaxy that's 10 million light years away, extremely hard to resolve, probably isn't resolved. But we can after the fact sometimes. And that source, that star itself, probably isn't emitting enough light to detect it. So it's a distance thing. However, if we were in, say, the Milky Way and a star started to behave very strangely and then exploded, we would definitely be able to see the star, then the supernova exploded. But it's usually something we have to do after the fact. We never can really predict supernova yet because there's too many galaxies to know. Yeah. But I'm going to touch on that today because I think I have a really interesting case study that addresses that exact question, since that's the title of the talk, watching a star explode. So hopefully I provide you that at least. Cool. Okay, so a little bit of audience participation. I showed you a lot of supernovae in galaxies. I think you're prepared to find the supernova in this galaxy. So I'm just going to do this by show of hands. I'll start from the start in reverse. So how many people think that the dot in this galaxy at number 4 is the supernova? 1, 2. Okay, about an 8. Okay, 4. Okay. How about 3? None. Okay, sad. Okay, how about 2? Shall I go back to 3?
Yeah, the thingy up there is nice.
What? Oh, this turned off?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so I got 1, I think. How about 2? 2. Okay. I didn't do 1. How about 1? Okay, a lot for one, but still a good amount for 4 though, right? I think we're almost split, maybe like 1/3, 2/3. Yeah. So you're completely right. It's number 1. This was the explosion of a white dwarf in a nearby galaxy in 1994. So I wasn't even born. But this was one of 4, the first 4 supernovae of 1994. Maybe it was a good year. Maybe you weren't around. And you'll see how bright it is relative to its host galaxy. All right, so a little harder. Yeah. Sorry?
What is?
Oh, number 4, I think, is like a foreground star, like a star that's either in the way or it's a part of the galaxy that it may be a region of very hot hydrogen gas that's forming stars, a star forming region. That's one possibility. I don't think that this has any resolved stars in this galaxy. But yeah, that's a good question. And number 2 is the galactic nucleus of the galaxy, which is a whole nother fascinating science that you can study about why the centers of galaxies that host supermassive black holes are really luminous or not luminous. So very fascinating stuff. Okay, so I think you're ready for a harder one. How about now? Well, take your time. I think you can figure it out.
The way to block out the foreground star, the restart from the actual galaxy.
Is there a way to block it out? Not in typically, if you need to, yeah. There are instruments that can block out stars, like when we study exoplanets around other stars, but that's not for other galaxies. But usually we don't block them out. We just have to deal with them. Yeah. Okay, so let's start with number 1. Okay. All right. Number 2? None, really. Okay. All right, number 3? One's kind of uncertain. Okay, how about number 4? Really? Okay. Y'all are really good. Okay. Congrats. That's great. This one always stumps people. So yes, number 4 is a supernova that I actually worked on in 2019. It was the first project I had in grad school. It was a really cool supernova that exploded in this beautiful host galaxy, M100. And we think it came from a very particular type of star system involving 2 white dwarfs, but the resulting supernova was kind of faint. It was a faint and supernova. So we think that the white dwarfs were pretty low mass, and they basically exchanged mass and then exploded as what we call a weak explosion. And the technical term for this type of explosion is called a calcium-rich supernovae. And it means that once we observed it and understood the atomic structure of what it was made out of, it was very rich in its calcium emission lines. So we'll talk about spectra a little bit later. But yeah, this is awesome. I'm glad you could find this. So I want to transition into the explosion of just one of the most common explosions in the universe, which is the explosion of a red supergiant star. And I wanted to highlight our local red supergiant, Betelgeuse, in the Orion Nebula. So this is probably one of the best studied examples of a red supergiant that has some interesting behavior that may hint at what we thought was, an imminent explosion. At least that's what we thought when researchers saw this dramatic dimming of Betelgeuse, which was observed in basically 2018 through 2020. And it's illustrated here in this visualization. So what we think is that Betelgeuse ejected some material, it formed some dust, and the dust obscured our line of sight. So it literally physically went dimmer. And all the supernova scientists got really excited because we thought, okay, maybe that means that Betelgeuse is going to explode, and then all our careers would also explode, and my life would explode, and having a galactic supernova would just uproot everything and be amazing all at the same time. But actually, it's something that was pretty predictable, and we still think that Betelgeuse will exist and live for another at least 100,000 years, maybe tens of thousands of years. So probably will not be around to see it. But Betelgeuse is basically the star that I want you to think about when I'm talking about the specific explosion that we're going to highlight today, which is the next part of our talk. So red supergiants are amazing creatures in the world because they are these massive stars, 10, 20 times the mass of our sun. They're extremely puffed up, 1,000 times the radius of our sun. if you were to put them at our sun, they would extend out to, I think that's Neptune's orbit. Yeah, very far out in orbit. So they're extremely massive things, both in size and in radius. And they produce supernovae all the time. They produce the most common type of supernova, the type 2 supernova, or the core collapse supernovae. Yeah, so any questions about Betelgeuse? If I can, I just wanted to highlight it. Yeah.
Is that an actual image of it?
Yes, so this actually is a resolved image of Betelgeuse.
Okay, what's the bright spot?
The bright spot is just, I think it's, well, okay, that's a good question. I'm gonna like speculate here. I think that it's just, yeah, I don't really know actually. Yeah, I think it's an artifact of the image, but I'm not sure. That's a great question. So I'll look into that. Yeah, what I maybe can answer that question is that the surface of red supergiants are really, really fascinating. So on the surface, this is a simulation of what we think the surface of red supergiants look like. So maybe that explains some sort of flaring and other things like that. But basically, the surface of red supergiant is this big convective cell. So we have gas going up and down and up and down and turning around. And so the whole study of red supergiant envelopes and red supergiant exteriors is a whole fascinating science in itself. What we also want to know is, as stellar astronomers, is what types of stars are also not only just behaving normally, like red supergiants like Betelgeuse, but what stars are also ejecting incredible amounts of material? What stars are undergoing violent eruptions? Why are they undergoing violent eruptions? Can we then trace that behavior when we see supernovae produced from stars that might have done that? And the answer is yes. And that's basically why I study what I do, because I want to understand what are stars doing before they die, and how can we use supernovae to basically wind back the cosmic clock and say this star was doing this thing, and this means that it was evolving this way, and then it resulted in this violent explosion. So very much the connection between the two is an unsolved question. And here at UC Berkeley, a couple of amazing scientists on my floor in Campbell are working on red supergiants in different ways. So graduate student Andrea Antony is working on convection cells inside of red supergiants. So red supergiants are a very hot topic here at UC Berkeley. And then postdoc Benny Zhang is doing something that I actually really want to understand in terms of observations, which is he's simulating the explosion, or basically the eruption of red supergiants pre-supernova. So this is the star just unbinding material because something inside of its core, inside of its interior before it dies, tells it to throw off material. So essentially that's an injection of energy somewhere inside the star into its envelope, and then the envelope responds by basically, throwing up a little bit of its outer gas, and that gets expelled in these simulations like this. So these are things that are simulated, and as an observer, I want to try to confirm these things because I really want to understand red supergiants, not only in life, but in death as well. Okay, so like I said, the biggest thing that I want to convey today is that we, as supernova scientists, want to understand red supergiant stars, and we want to connect them to the supernovae that we see in distant galaxies. So Betelgeuse is a red supergiant that we see in our Milky Way. We see other red supergiants in our Milky Way. They're behaving pretty normally. But then we also know that in other galaxies, red supergiants are exploding. And we think we understand the evolutionary track. We went through it, burning stages, fusion, etc., to get to a point where a massive star could explode. But what we do not understand is some things about what we're seeing from the supernovae themselves, and why stars in our own galaxy are not behaving the same way. So the biggest open question, and what keeps my lights on and my rent paid, is this open question of what do red supergiants do right before they die? And before we get into that, I want to define three things so that you're not like taken off guard by when I say them in the talk, but I'll continue to reiterate them. They're just three technical terms that have to relate to now like new science. So we're really getting into stuff that's new. This is stuff that was just published, and this relates to how stars explode, specifically how red supergiants explode. So the first definition that you'll need is circumstellar material. That's just gas that the star used to have on its surface, but now it ejected it and put it in its local environment. It's just sitting around the star at the time of explosion, circumstellar. The other thing is a spectrum. Maybe that's a little bit more familiar. In astronomy, we like to take spectra of supernovae because that reveals what atomic and molecular and types of gas the star or the supernova is made out of. And we could take a spectrum to do that because it splits the light up into many, many pieces, into energy packets, into wavelengths. And that can allow us to see individual atomic transitions. So we can say there's hydrogen there, there's calcium there, this star exploded in it and produced silicon. So that's one thing that you want to know. And then a light curve, which is basically what it sounds like. It is the change in brightness of a supernovae or a star or anything that's changing in brightness over time. So you'll need these three things for the last part of the talk. Okay, so let's get into the new stuff. And with that, I want to motivate what I went into the study wanting to work on and what my field is really focused on, which is young supernovae. So trying to see explosions in the first day, if not hours, that they occur. So the star once was a star, it collapses, it produces a supernovae, and what I want to do is point our telescopes at this exploding star as soon as possible. Because the sooner you can observe a star after death, the easier it is to understand what was sitting around that star. What did that star do right before it died? And so once a star explodes, like our massive star, like a red supergiant, it will then expand and it will collide with this circumstellar material. There was gas the star had thrown off or erupted or ejected right before explosion. So that's the most local stuff. And that actually represents the last, basically, steps of its evolution right before death. And if I can point my telescope at a supernovae that is undergoing this process of colliding with gas from its star in the first day or week before explosion, and I can gain photons from it, then I can understand not only the composition of that stuff, I can help understand what type of star could have produced that type of supernovae. I can try to understand why a star would throw off that type of material. There's a lot of amazing things you can do by observing young supernovae and gaining photons, because we're really observing the first signatures of stellar death and that transition between life, the last instances of massive star life, and the first instances of stellar death. And so with that, I'm part of a collaboration that uses telescopes on Hawaii called the Pan-STARRS telescopes, and our survey is called the Young Supernova Experiment. Our aim is to try to scan the night sky every night, try to tile the same place every 3 nights, so we can look back and see if something's new every 3 nights. So it gives us kind of a nice window to try to see if something was there or it wasn't there. And our goal is to try to find supernovae as young as possible, hours after explosion, days after explosion. And that is really the motivating transient survey, the motivating telescope survey behind the story of Supernova 2020 TLF. So in 2020, an explosion went off in a nearby galaxy, nearby to us, but 120 million light years actually, so pretty far in the scheme of things. And we got really excited because our survey had detected it and found it and reported it to the world. And so immediately we wanted to answer these questions. So what star produced it? What did the star do before it died? And what can we learn from this explosion in general? So you now are really accustomed to seeing what host galaxies plus their supernovae look like. So the Supernova 2020 TLF is highlighted right here. It's extremely bright compared to its nice, beautiful spiral galaxy. And we found it on September 16th, 2020. So that's the first piece of the story. We're in September 2020. We're really excited because our transient survey found something. And what we did is we had some time on the Keck telescopes in Hawaii, and we had only taken imaging of this source, of this supernova. So we knew it was a supernova. We didn't know what it was made of. We didn't know what type of supernova it was. So we needed to take a spectrum. So what we did is we used the Keck telescopes in Hawaii, and we took a spectrum. And as soon as we had found the source, and the spectrum looked like this. This really, really hot thing. You can tell it's hot because its continuum is extremely sharp. And other than that, we don't have to talk about any of the other lines that we're seeing, but we had classified it as a supernova for sure. And then let me get into what are these lines. So we're kind of getting into the weeds of this right now, but I think that it's really fascinating to look at supernova spectra because it can tell us information either about the explosion or about the environment that the star exploded into. So the black line is the supernova spectrum, and these narrow lines, these very sharp peaks, are radiation from the gas, from the circumstellar material that was sitting around the red supergiant at the time of explosion. And so you can think about the whole continuum as this basically this flashlight, and it's shining through this gas that was emitted, that was erupted, that was ejected from the red supergiant in the last days, hours, years before explosion. And now the supernova has collided with it, just like that animation that I showed you. And then this red line is from our friends who are theorists. And we can say, I found an explosion that seems to have collided with some gas. What would that look like? And if you simulated it in a supercomputer? And so we have nice friends that do this, and that's the red line. That's the model. So it fits pretty well. And it tells us that there is almost an entire sun's worth of gas sitting around this red supergiant at the time of explosion. That's how much material this star, this red supergiant, threw off right before it exploded and then rammed back into that same material. So spectroscopy is fascinating. It's very complicated, but I wanted to share what it actually looks like to observe them in terms of spectra. Yeah.
So if you're saying the material is
Yep.
the hour or and late through that.
And then the star collapsed, and then the supernova went off, and the star started to expand in this supernova, and then the supernova material collided with that same gas. Yeah. And that caused this radiation and this stuff. Yeah, exactly.
But is that a light curve?
No, this is a spectrum. So on the x-axis is individual colors, almost like pieces of light. We've broken it down into very, very finite pieces. And then on the y-axis is flux. So yeah, I will show you a light curve right now, very soon. So the story goes that we found this supernova. We knew that its star had ejected a lot of material. And I was very interested in this because I thought that potentially our transient survey, our telescope survey, had detected the star itself before explosion. I looked at the data. I was kind of convinced of it. I told the collaboration, and they were skeptical. So we looked into it in more detail. And what we found when we looked at the supernova location before explosion, what we do is we look at the supernova location. This is actually a zoomed in image of where the supernova will eventually go off. And then we look at it a little closer to the explosion, and maybe you're starting to see something there. And then if we subtract the two, we find this immensely luminous source. So what this is not an explosion. It is not a transient. It is the red supergiant itself erupting material and radiating so luminously that we could detect it with a ground-based telescope. So these are individual photons from a red supergiant undergoing an immense tumultuous activity of stellar eruption, of violent eruption before explosion. So that same material that we saw the supernova collide with, we also took images of that stuff being thrown off by the red supergiant. Doesn't look as fascinating because it just kind of looks like a blob, but that's basically the extent of what we could resolve because it's in a galaxy 100 million light years away. But this is the first time we've ever seen this. We've seen red supergiants in the Milky Way. We've seen explosions of red supergiants in other galaxies. We've never seen the red supergiant do something that was detectable before the supernova itself. So the four bands are different colors. This is the bluest one, so it's G band, green, red. I is kind of pushing towards infrared, and Z is very much in the infrared. So what our bodies radiate at. That's a great question. So how about a light curve? So the light curve is actually this thing right here. And I wanted to show it. I know it's a little complicated and it's getting into the weeds of actually like the science itself, but it's kind of cool to show this because this piece right here is the star itself. This is the luminosity we're getting from the red supergiant itself. And then this is the luminosity that we get from the explosion of the red supergiant. And these are different phases of the evolution. So this is when the hydrogen in the supernova starts to come back together and the electrons come back onto the atoms and it recombines. And these are just like technical things, but I wanted to show you what real supernova light curves look like when we study them. So it really is in time and in luminosity, the light curve. Yeah.
We saw a super red giant result that after that later, just ahead of time, pulsing off or whatever. Why can you not see that here as well?
Yeah, so it's just the scale really. So it's so faint compared to this the luminosity of the explosion, which is, you know, almost 1 million times greater in scale, so order of magnitude wise. And yeah, so we just really can't see the undulations, but I think this animation will help. So what we have here is the individual images, and I have it circled where you should be looking for the photons. And there, yeah, there it was. There was some individual photons from the red supergiant. So really what we want to do is combine all these images together to try to see if there's something really bright. But what we can find is that these are actual detections of the red supergiant itself. So this is what's happening in terms of a simulation. This is just like animation that we did for a press release. But this is essentially in this galaxy back in time, this is what the red supergiant was doing. It was blowing off material, and it was causing the ejection of that material. That material then produced photons that we then observed here on Earth 120 million light years later. And those are the individual photons that you can see. And then this is that same image here in its host galaxy. So you can resolve the red supergiant itself and its photons from its ejection episode. And we've never seen anything like this. It's very, very fascinating. And then, yeah.
I'm sorry, you've got this 120 plus day sequence
Yeah.
available to you only because you're in the sky
Every night.
in the same spot over and over.
Yep. And going back to our question about can we actually predict these events? Can we? Because I'm showing you that we can find the red supergiant. We can see it sometimes before it explodes. Why didn't I know that this was going to go off in supernova? Because we just weren't looking for it. We didn't know if this was real. We didn't know if these photons that we were getting in this little circle here at minus 100 days, minus 50 days before explosion were real. And we hadn't really done the analysis. But now we know. Now we know it's possible. So now we can start doing this in real time. And if we start to see sources that look like this, like there's some sort of strange emission that's not quite a supernova, but it's not quite a star, then maybe we should start, pointing our telescopes at it every night. And in the advent of new telescopes that are more powerful, we'll be trying to find these all the time. Yeah.
There's core collapse supernova. There's no hydrogen or helium spectral line at all, right? So that's a whole different subset of supernova.
So red supergiants are core collapse supernovae. Yeah. So they're type 2 supernovae. So they do have hydrogen. Yeah.
So I guess it's best there's some that do slough off their entire outer layers of hydrogen.
Yep.
Is that what may have happened here or not? Is that unrelated?
So it did blow off a lot of its hydrogen, but not all of it. So when it exploded, it still had hydrogen. So we still saw hydrogen, helium, and stuff. However, there are stars exactly like that that undergo eruptions so dramatic that they blow off all their hydrogen, and they explode as type 1 supernovae, so hydrogen-less supernovae. And they can come from massive stars as well. Yeah.
Not seen that.
We haven't seen the eruption, but we've seen indirect evidence that it has happened. Yeah, exactly. So I'm getting towards the end of the time, but I think we're almost there. Let's explode this star. So it's erupting, and that is the resulting supernovae in photons over here on the right. So then the same telescope pointed and collected these photons, and the supernova is much, much brighter. And this is the simulation that we saw that we made for this. And then this was the supernova in its host galaxy. So that's the red supergiant post-explosion. Yeah. And the photons are much, much easier to detect. So yeah. And so yeah, this was the first time that we had seen a red supergiant doing anything really before explosion. And then we could tie it to an actual terminal explosion event, a supernova itself. And we got to share it with the world. which was very great for me because astronomy is for you all. It's for the people. And I don't do this just on my own or in a vacuum. I want the public to be involved and engaged. So earlier this year, we had a press release that went all over the world, and we got feedback and we got to share it with everyone coming from UC Berkeley. Yeah, I think my favorite is the one about, the dying agony, stars dying agony. I think we can all relate. At least I can. So what have we learned? I've given you a lot tonight, and I appreciate it. And I hope you come away knowing that stellar explosions are complicated, but also instrumental to life on Earth. And what have we learned about this particular science case that I've gone through today? So supernova 2020 TLF was an explosion of a red supergiant. Our transient survey, our supernova survey, saw the star itself undergoing some sort of eruptions or mass loss behavior. Then the star exploded and produced this violent, beautiful event called supernova 2020 TLF. And now we have the fun of trying to find more, and we have the fun of trying to understand in terms of simulations, theoretical work, why are red supergiants doing that? Why are red supergiants undergoing this violent eruptions? We're not seeing that kind of behavior really from red supergiants in our Milky Way galaxy. Betelgeuse is one example where something is going on, but it's clearly not as violent as this. Otherwise, we'd be looking at it every night. It would change brightness dramatically. So why are red supergiants in other galaxies undergoing such crazy behavior, but red supergiants in our galaxy are not? That goes for a lot of stars. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg. So we get to learn so much more with this science. And with that, thank you, and I'll take some questions.